Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up. The three books we'll be chatting about today would be Starling House, Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White, and Tyranny of Faith. I'll have timestamps as always if you'd like to skip ahead to any one specific book. I'm going to start with Starling House, then we're going to go to Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White, then Tyranny of Faith. And just a reminder, I will be for the first quarter of this year talking about some of the new releases from last year as well, but then once the second quarter hits, we're just going to be sticking to 2024 releases. But actually, two of the three of these books actually have come out this year. It's just Starling House that came out last year. So I'm going to start with this one, as the other two are sequels, so I figure this one is the one that's easiest for people to just pick up and get into. Starling House for me is one that I could see this being very easily accessible, not just because it's a standalone and thus you don't have to read anything else, but because of the way it's sort of partially fiction, partially fantasy. I actually felt that I would have enjoyed, I think, more heavily leaning into the fantasy elements, because it kind of sat so much on the line of those two genres that I can sometimes like when that happens, but for me this balance didn't quite work, but I do think it's going to work for a lot of other people. The setup is that you follow this young woman who is now responsible for caring for her younger brother. She has cared for him for years, ever since their mom passed away, and in a lot of ways her youth, her childhood has been taken as she has had to become the parent to her younger brother. And the dynamics between these siblings were my favorite part of the book. I think for a lot of people who have had to take that on, maybe it's not necessarily for a sibling, but anytime you've had to take on from an early age caring for someone else in your family or a friend, anything like that, I think they're going to really connect to the relationship and the bond between these two characters. And I do actually miss, or at least I should say, I wish we had more familial relationships like these two have in this book, because I thought that was the best part about Starling House. The fantasy elements come in when our main character, there's this house in their very small town, and their small town is within our own world, but this house has always been very mysterious. The family that owned it always seemed very mysterious, and our main character one day notices that there's somebody home, and usually this house is relatively abandoned, and she takes it upon herself to kind of go up to the house, to look at the house, and she ends up meeting the person who is now living there. And through some interesting circumstances, she ends up becoming employed by this person and cleaning up the house. And pretty quickly, she's realizing this house is not quite what it seems, or maybe it's exactly what it seems, and it's as odd as everybody thought it would be. There's also a lot of mystery with the town and its history and intergenerational trauma, and how that plays a role in the descendants of people that have lived in this town in the past. It kind of briefly examines people who were mistreated in the past and how that plays a role in these future generations. So on the surface, it seems like something I would have really, really liked, but the Starling House itself, like I was saying, that's where the fantasy elements are, and that's what I wanted to see more of, this really odd, creepy, atmospheric, almost Southern Gothic feeling house, and I didn't find there was hardly anything really in comparison to some of the other horror books I've read or haunted house type of books I've read. It's not like How to Sell a Haunted House, where the house itself is not really, haunted. It's not quite like that. I mean, the house really does play a role, but it's not as integral of a part of the story as I think I expected, given the name of the book is Starling House. I also found that there is a romantic plotline in this. That's another reason that I could see a lot of people finding this quite accessible, because I know a lot of people really like seeing romances in their books. For me, the romance, I didn't think it was as well developed as the sibling relationship. And when you have one relationship that's so well done and another one that isn't as well done, I think having one in the book that is well done really highlights what we're missing over here, because it was like brooding, mysterious man, all of a sudden I guess we're in love. And I wished we'd had a little bit more seeing the characters start to develop feelings for each other. I didn't really find that we had. It was kind of like, well, we're beside each other often. Proximation to one another equals falling in love. So I wasn't the biggest fan of the romance, but some people really like the brooding, mysterious person who all of a sudden it's just like, oh, I guess the tension's actually because they have feelings for each other. So you might really like that aspect of this. Overall, I think if you are fans of Adrian Young's books, this reminded me in some ways, as far as the small town, how real world things are tied to a fantasy element. And Adrian Young is one that I've read a few books from, and even though I really like the writing, those elements haven't quite lined up for me. But obviously Adrian Young is quite successful, and a lot of people really, really love their work. So if you like that, I think there's a good chance you would like Starling House. And then, of course, if any of the pros that I highlighted sound really good to you, the cons might not be a big deal, and plus maybe the cons don't even sound like cons for you. But anyway, I did do a reading vlog for Starling House, as it was a patron pick. So if you are interested in seeing more thoughts, that vlog is up over on my Patreon. I'll have that linked in the description bar down below. Getting now to our sequels, Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White. This is the last book in the series, as it's just a duology. In the first book, you are introduced to this fantasy world that has rich lore, and there's so much to dissect. There's so many different factions that have their own culture, their own custom, their own connections to their magic. So it's almost like the opposite of Starling House, in that there's a lot to dissect in this. There's a lot with the magic, to a point where there's actually different magic systems depending on where different people are from. And there is this sense of colonialism, colonization, outside antagonists coming in and trying to erase everything that is there, as they believe that their way of life trumps that of the people who live in this land. And I think that those themes were handled really well. I did find in the sequel, our antagonists were sort of pushed aside so that we could almost create antagonists out of people in, or figures in the lore. So that was interesting to see. And I thought the imagery was really vivid and really well done. I mean, the details in this are great. The descriptions are great. And it just feels like something I would love to see on screen. I would love to see really amazing animators make something with this world, or even a video game would be really cool. But I did feel like it came across somewhat meandering in this one. And I actually think it could have benefited from being a trilogy. Duologies and trilogies are tough because of the typical, sometimes trilogies end up having middle book syndrome because they could have been condensed, and then sometimes duologies could have stretched out, and thus it feels like we're lacking a little bit. And I think that the second one, while it did have a very satisfying but bittersweet ending, it just felt like the stakes that we'd built up at the end of the first one, they didn't feel as serious, because we are obviously traversing and navigating all of that within just this one more book. But they really, like, the stakes were way up here by the end of the first one. So I think that this could have been a trilogy. I've said before, it reminds me of Shadow of the Fox. Different lore, of course, as Shadow of the Fox is Japanese inspired, this is Chinese inspired. But some similar plot progressions, and I think some of the things that are represented in the stories are somewhat similar. And interestingly, Shadow of the Fox, I think, had middle book syndrome, but the ending being contained into mostly the third book, as far as, like, the third book was pretty much just one last big battle. It kind of worked because we'd had enough time to really feel the weight of the consequences, where in this one I didn't really find I felt that as strongly. Still would definitely recommend this duology. I think that the love story in this one is very sweeping and sort of this star-crossed lovers sort of thing, where these people that are different in personality, they come from different backgrounds, and everything's at stake for them, and they just want to find a way to come back to each other. It's one of those types of love stories within the middle of what is a basically earth-ending type of stakes for them anyway, like their country and their lives as they know it are on the brink of being taken over. So it had really, really big stakes, but we zeroed in, like I said, on some new antagonists, and it kind of created something that was a tiny bit underwhelming for me. I do wonder if this, I was just saying maybe it could be a trilogy, but I almost wonder if it could have been a really long standalone, if that would have helped as well. But again, I know it sounds like I'm being a little bit negative on it. It's just because it was a conclusion, and for me, as a conclusion, it was fine. It was good. It's just not maybe as impactful as I was hoping. And then now getting to Tyranny of Faith. This one I loved. I thought this was an enormous improvement from the first book, and I already liked the first book. The first book would be Justice of Kings. The setup for the story is you are following a character named Helena, who is telling you about her time as what is basically like a protege, an apprentice to this man named Sir Conrad von Volt. Von Volt is somebody who is, I always describe him as judge, jury, executioner, all in one, and detective. He investigates crimes that pertain to, sometimes they're small, and there's just a small little crime within a small little village. Other times it's things that will affect the whole empire. And he's tracking people down. He is basically handing out sentences based off of his findings, and he is trained to have certain powers to help him with this. And the powers that he has are things that pretty much nobody else is allowed access to. And there's a lot of questions that the book handles, I think, really well, and there's a lot of philosophical debates about that much power being in one person's hands, because this person cannot be infallible. There's just no way. You're going to have weaknesses. You're going to have moments where you have a personal vendetta. You're going to hate the person even though the law says something else. You're going to think this person deserves a stronger sentence, but your superior, the emperor, isn't going to allow you for XYZ reason. And I think that all of those were done well in the first book, but I thought they did that really well. I thought the author did those really well in this second book. There were also some really fantastic, kind of brief, random moments of reflection or character development that I was kind of taken aback by. There's a whole section about a character who, not a whole section, but it's a brief exchange between two of our main characters, Helena, and then a side character from the first book who comes along in the second book and kind of becomes a part of their party. And they're having a conversation about his drinking habits, and Helena is saying, please, you're one of the only people left in this world that I care about and that I love, and I can't stand to see you hurting yourself. It hurts me, basically, is the gist of what she was saying. And he kind of gives details about why he drinks, and he opens up about what he's gone through, and it's just one of those moments in a book where it's not just character development for that character, it's just something so common to people in our own world who have experienced PTSD, who have seen really traumatic things, gone through really traumatic things, and how they try to cope, the imperfect ways we try to handle the awful things that we have had to endure. And that part made me kind of weirdly emotional, even though it's such a short moment, and this character is normally such a rough and gruff kind of character. There's also a number of times that this book made me laugh out loud, and I can't say what made me laugh, but there were a few jokes that it was basically the same joke multiple times. And for those that have read it, I'm going to try to say something that makes it clear to you what I'm saying, but that people who haven't read it won't know. But basically, an injury that is sustained from the first book and now is kind of something one of the characters has to deal with in the second book. When that character and then the rough and gruff character, when they argue or make fun of each other and that gets brought up, it shouldn't have been funny, but it was. The multiple times that arose, I laughed. It was such dark, kind of morbid humor, especially at one point when, well, one of them, the character just, I don't want to say too much. They throw something and they're like, hey, and that's not going to mean anything to anybody if you haven't read it. But it might not even mean anything if you have read it. There's also another scene where the rough and gruff character shoots a bow and arrow, and then Helena asks the other character, like, oh, wow, can you do that? And his response was so funny. It was anyway, so there were moments in this that really made me laugh, even though it's not a funny book all around. It's almost like, what if most of the time Abercrombie was serious and then a little bit of his humor poked through? It was kind of like that, because so much of it is very gritty and raw, and I would say falls under grim dark. And then you get these moments that are that just sort of catch you by surprise, and they make them that much funnier because the rest of the time it is so serious. If you are a fan of horror books or horror elements in your fantasy, that's another thing I want to highlight, because you don't really see that too much in the first book, but in the second book you really start to lean into some pretty creepy things. I was like, wow, this is really dark and so bleak and so depressing, and it kind of has to do with almost like necromancer type of magic, but in a way I've never seen before. So I was really quite captivated by that. It wasn't my favorite part. My favorite part is the politicking and the philosophical musings, but I do think that part was done well. It's just not the thing that I tend to gravitate toward as much. But I liked the fresh, unique take on it. And I think a lot of other people are going to really enjoy that. I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy this series as a whole, and I can't wait to read the last one because it's out officially now. So I should be getting around to that soon. That's it, though, for this new fantasy releases wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these, what your thoughts were on them. If you're interested in picking any of these up, or just in general you're interested in new fantasy, I'll have my new fantasy playlist linked, as well as purchase links to these books. And I always have bookshop.org linked because you can find pretty much all the new fantasy that I've chatted about on that page. But if that's not as accessible to you, there will be some other links as well. But anyway, that's it. And let me know your thoughts. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.